Today we will be solving equations with fraction coefficients. What on earth does that mean? Well, these are one-step equations here on this page, but we can have multi-step equations with fractional coefficients as well. The coefficient, let's start with that. That is the number right next to the x. It's the thing that you're multiplying by the variable. And in this case, it's going to be right here. Oops. And we're going to zoom in a little. I can write it a little better. Whoa. All right. So again, coefficient, that is the part of the equation that is being multiplied by your variable. Next to it is the variable itself. In this case, the variable here is x. It usually is, but it can be any letter or any symbol at all, actually. Over here, we have a 3, and this is called a constant. And the reason it's called a constant is because it doesn't change. If you change the value of x, the 3 is still a 3. So if you can imagine I say x is equal to 1, then this term here would be equal to 5 because 5 times 1 is 5. If I said x is equal to 2, then this here would be equal to 10 because 5 times 2 is 10. So that number changes depending on the value of x. But if you look at 3 and I say x is equal to 8, that plus 3 is still plus 3. It stays constant, and so that is its special name. So as we go on and we look here, if you're going to be multiplying a fraction by its reciprocal, they are always going to be equal to 1. And an example of that, if you had 3/4 and you multiplied it by its reciprocal, which means that's when we flip that fraction over, 4/3, what you'd end up with is 3 times 4 is 12, and 4 times 3 is 12, and 12 divided by 12 is 1. So anything multiplied by its reciprocal is always 1. Same thing here, let's do -5/2 times its reciprocal, and actually I should use parentheses here. It's because I need a negative as well, -2/5. And what we end up with, again, if we multiply the numerators, the top numbers together, we have 5 times 2 is 10. Notice on the denominator, the bottom, 2 times 5 is 10. And again, the negative times a negative is a positive, leaving us with +1. So there it is again, always equal to 1. So how does that help us here? Well, we're looking at solving 2/5 x equals 100. The coefficient in this is 2/5, variable is x, and our constant is 100. And we want to get rid of the 2/5 so we can isolate the x, isolate the variable. And normally we would write divided by 2/5. And we do to both sides, divided by 2/5. But if you remember that old saying, your teacher said, you can't divide by a fraction, you have to multiply by its reciprocal. So what we can do is just start with that. Why go the extra step? I can start by multiplying both sides by 5/2, the reciprocal of 2/5. Whatever you do on one side, you must do on the other. And here's what happens. The left side, notice that if you multiply it, you get 10/10x, which is the same as 1x. On the other side, you end up with 5 times 100. What you can do is multiply these together. That's 500 divided by 2. And when you divide those two, you get 250. as your x value. Notice when you multiply fractions in a whole number, you could put a 1 underneath the whole number to make it into a fraction as well. So as we look at b, and we see that our coefficient is a fraction, we're going to take its reciprocal, in this case, 2/9. And whatever we do on one side, we have to do on the other. So we're going to multiply by 2/9 there as well. That's going to leave us with 1x, or 18/18x, which is still 1. And on the other side, we can again multiply straight across and then divide. However, remember cross-canceling. If I divide 27 by 9, I get 3. And if I divide 9 by 9, I get 1, leaving us with 6/1. So we finished up part B. We got x equals 6. And now we move on to letter C. Take a second before you watch this video and see if you can figure out what would you multiply both sides by. Right now we have -3/4 x equals 21, and I want to get rid of the -3/4 times the x, so I got to do the opposite, which is divide. But guess what? Coefficient is a fraction, so I'm going to multiply by its reciprocal instead, which is a -4/3. But whatever I do on one side, I have to do on the other. So here we also have times -4/3. And then when it comes to solving, notice on the left side there's two negatives. A negative times a negative is a positive. And 4 times 3 is 12. And 3 times 4 is 12x, which is the same as positive 1x. So there we go. We've got x by itself. On the other side, I'm going to do a little bit of cross-canceling again. Both the 3 and the 21 can both be divided by 3. So 3 divided by 3 is 1. 21 divided by 3 is 7. I like to figure out my signs often first so I don't forget them at the end. A positive times a negative, we are going to have a negative answer. And we're left with 7 times 4 in the numerator, 28. And we're left with 1 times 1 in the denominator. And anything over 1 is just itself. So we end up with -28 is our value for x. All right, one last one. Go ahead, what do you think? What do you multiply both sides by? There's that fraction again, 2/3. Our coefficient is 2/3. We're going to multiply by 3/2. And from here, again, we're going to end up with 1x. If you want to go ahead and solve that out, you'd have 6/6x or 1x. On this side, I'm going to do some more cross-canceling again. It's just a little easier. 12 and 2 can both be divided by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. 12 divided by 2 is 6. And we're left with 6 times 3 is 18. We could also write 18/1, but that's the same thing as 18. So there you have it, guys. If your coefficient is a fraction, you can just multiply by its reciprocal